Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Parth Bapat, a visiting faculty at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This module is Introduction to Environment. It is part of the paper Environment and Society. In this module, we are looking at aspects of environment and ecology. It describes the linkages between biotic and abiotic factors, components. Let's start our discussion by understanding the concept of environment. What does this term environment really mean? A dictionary generally gives the meaning of this word as the complete range of external conditions in which an organism lives. So, the environment of any given organism would obviously include the air, water, light, and other such physical factors that are present around it. It would also have to include all the other organisms, from bacteria to plants to animals, which are present around that organism. But what if that given organism happens to be a human? Then our understanding of the term environment has to be expanded a little more. As per current understanding, for a human who's living in a human society, environment includes not only the physical and biological factors around that human being, but also the social, cultural, political, and economic frameworks in which that human organism lives. So, in the times that we live in, this is how the term environment is broadly understood. Now let us go back to our dictionary meaning of environment and check out an interesting aspect of the definition. If environment is defined as the conditions in which an organism lives, it means that the meaning of the term is not common to all organisms. Rather, it is organism specific. That is, each organism's environment is unique to that organism. So, a sparrow in its nest in the eaves of a house and a rat in its burrow in the floor of that same house are in two different environments. Similarly, the environment of a quail perched on the branch of a tree and that of a barbet occupying a hole in that same branch would also be different. The environment of a person in Mumbai is a little different from that of a person in Thane, considerably different from that of a person in Pune, and vastly different from that of a person in Delhi. But on the other hand, even if you and I are sitting in the very same room on the very same sofa, our environments are technically different because my environment would include you while yours would include me. So, if I am a restless person fidgeting and moving about while you are a tranquil person sitting unobstructively in one place, then your environment will contain disturbance and action while mine will have peace and quiet. The environment of an organism is constantly changing, however small or big that change may be. Sometimes the change is climatic. The angle at which sunlight is falling, it may change. A cloud may float in and block out the sunlight. A breeze may start blowing or maybe stop blowing, or a thunderstorm may hit. At other times, the change is caused by another organism. A tussock of grass may have a blade chewed off by a goat. A leaf on a tree branch may get shaded by a crow's nest in the branch above. Or you may get bitten by a mosquito. For a human, the change may even be mainly a cultural one. Your long-time neighbor, who was culturally very similar to you, may get replaced by a person who is culturally very different from you. The organism is constantly responding to such changes in one way or the other. Often, the response is an action that makes the organism feel more comfortable or helps it to survive. A lizard exposed to a noontime sun may crawl under a rock to escape the discomfort of the sun beating down on it. The leaf being shaded by the crow's nest may change its angle to avoid the shade and receive more light. And you may possibly respond by swatting that irritating mosquito or that irritating new neighbor for that matter. In this manner, there are constant interactions happening between every organism and its environment. The components of an organism's environment are traditionally divided into living, or what is called biotic components, and non-living or abiotic components. Abiotic components, as one may easily comprehend, include the various physico-chemical factors around the organisms: air, water, light, temperature, humidity, salinity, pH, that is relative acidity or alkalinity, rainfall, snowfall, wind speed, wave action. These can all count as abiotic components of an organism's environment. Biotic components include all the other organisms occupying the environment of a given organism. From the point of view of a given organism, it includes other individuals of its own species as well as individuals of other species that live around it. Does the term biotic include only the living? What about dead organisms? Or scraps of flesh, skin, hair, or claws separated from the body of an organism? Well, though such material is technically lifeless, it is distinctly different in structure and composition from any abiotic component. Materials generated within their bodies by organisms are composed of the same elements that make up the abiotic world and are also taken from the same abiotic world. But once taken up from the abiotic world, the organism processes them into complex materials which are unique to the biotic world. When an organism dies or a part of a living body gets separated from it, or the waste generated by a living body is excreted, all the resulting lifeless materials continue to retain their unique complexity for some time, till they get broken down into simple units. This breaking down of complex lifeless materials generated by the biotic world back into the simple units, typical of the abiotic world, happens through natural processes. These natural processes are commonly referred to as rotting or decay. So, till materials generated by organisms are completely disintegrated to the level typical of the abiotic world, they are considered to be biotic in nature. An organism lives essentially by acquiring materials and energy from its environment. The materials are required to maintain or develop the organism's body structure, and the energy is required to fuel its life-sustaining processes. The manner in which an organism acquires these materials and energy may be either direct or indirect. Some organisms obtain energy directly from the abiotic components of their environment. All such organisms are commonly referred to as autotrophs, meaning feeding oneself. Some such organisms obtain energy from chemicals in their environment and are referred to as chemotrophs, or feeding on chemicals. Chemotrophs live on ocean floor, in zones where sunlight does not reach. So we are unlikely to be familiar with any of them. But most other autotrophs obtain energy from sunlight and are referred to as phototrophs, meaning feeding on light. The phototrophs familiar to us are plants. Phototrophs are equipped to capture energy from sunlight and integrate into material which is then stored away within their bodies. This stored energy containing material is commonly referred to as food. Phototrophs tend to generate food in quantities that are very large in proportion to their own needs. Part of this stored food gets utilized on a daily basis to meet the day-to-day energy requirements of the plants. All the rest of the stored food at any given time is technically a surplus. This surplus, from the point of view of the phototroph, serves as an insurance against a possible future food shortage. But this surplus also represents a ready-made store of food that can be raided by non-autotrophs. That is, all those organisms which are not equipped to make their own food. So, autotrophs are commonly called as producers, since they produce the food on which non-autotrophs depend. Non-autotrophs, that is, organisms not equipped to make their own food, are referred to as heterotrophs, meaning feeding on others. They obtain energy by accessing, in some way or the other, the surplus stored food of autotrophs. The heterotrophs best known to us are animals, including worms, insects, shellfish, fishes, frogs, reptiles, birds, and of course mammals. Some heterotrophs obtain energy by directly eating up whole autotrophs or part of autotrophs. Such heterotrophs are commonly called herbivores, meaning plant eaters. Part of the energy the herbivores have thus grabbed from the autotrophs gets utilized to meet their own day-to-day energy requirements. The rest is stored away in their bodies. This stored surplus, from the point of view of the herbivores, is an insurance against a possible future food shortage. This again represents a ready-made store of food available to any other heterotroph which is willing to eat it. Herbivores familiar to us include grasshoppers, leaf-eating ants, fruit bats, and hares. The heterotrophs, which obtain energy by eating up herbivores, are commonly called carnivores, meaning flesh eaters. They too use as much energy as is required for their life processes and store away the rest. This stored surplus may get utilized by higher levels of carnivores, which feed upon other carnivores. The highest level of carnivore, which is not normally eaten by any other carnivore, such as eagles or tigers, is commonly referred to as an apex carnivore or apex predator. Other carnivores familiar to us include sharks, frogs, lizards, swallows, and foxes. There is another very distinctly different way in which some heterotrophs feed. They meet their energy requirements by accessing the stored energy lying locked up in either the waste excreted by other organisms or any scraps of once living material now separated from the bodies of organisms, or the actual dead bodies of organisms. All such material is technically called detritus. So such organisms are commonly referred to as detritivores. meaning detritus eaters. They are also referred to as saprotrophs, meaning feeding upon dead material. The saprotrophs best known to us are bacteria and fungi. But wait a minute, you will say, aren't the mushrooms which we eat supposed to be fungi too? Does this mean that humans eat detritus eaters? Oh yes, humans, or for that matter, many other heterotrophs may feed on saprotrophs. Saprotrophs commonly eaten by humans besides mushrooms include prawns, crabs and clams. Earthworms, millipedes and cockroaches are saprotrophs too. Of course, we don't eat them. Heterotrophs are also collectively referred to as consumers because they all consume either directly or indirectly the food made by producers. The interaction between an organism and the abiotic or biotic components of its environment is not limited to nutritional matters alone. Organisms also interact with different biotic and abiotic components of their environment to achieve locomotion, as in swinging from branches or swimming, transfer of reproductive material, as in pollination, transportation of propagative materials, as in seed dispersal, and so on. Some abiotic factors, if there is too much or too little of them, act as limiting factors which limit an organism's growth or reproduction or survival. Many of us would be aware of how too little nitrogen or too much salinity limits the growth of most plants. Another aspect is that different abiotic factors may be important or even crucial at different times in an organism's life. For instance, the biotic needs of an organism in its caterpillar phase are likely to be different from those in its adult butterfly phase. Or the seed germination stage of an organism is likely to be affected by abiotic factors which have little effect on its own mature plant stage. Biotic factors too can hinder or facilitate the developmental or reproductive success of an organism. Interactions of an organism with the individuals of its own species are referred to as intraspecific relationships. These commonly include interactions like mating and caring for one's offspring. Interactions of an organism which include other species are referred to as interspecific relationships. These commonly include interactions like predation, as in a lizard eating a fly, and parasitism, as in a flea living on a rat. Although the biotic and abiotic components of an organism's environment are often studied or treated separately, there are a lot of interconnections amongst them. For instance, consider a lily growing on a forest floor. How much sunlight this little plant receives depends jointly on a number of biotic and abiotic factors. The angle at which sunlight is falling, the amount of cloud cover through which the sunlight is passing, the shading effect of the surrounding vegetation, the loss of leaf surface from being devoured by a caterpillar, the covering of part of the leaf surface by insect eggs, cocoons or galls, and so on. If you observe the natural world around you, you will comprehend the range as well as complexities of the various relationships possible between an organism and its biotic and abiotic environment. If you study the interactions between organisms and their environments over a period of time, you are likely to discover at least 3 common but fascinating processes. What are these three processes? Let us have a short, quick look to get an idea of each of them. One process is that an organism gets inevitably influenced by its environment. So, we see that identical organisms, if exposed to distinctly different environments, may display different flowering and fruiting cycles, different behaviors, or even different physical forms. For instance, a plant which has been blossoming only once a year in Delhi may do so twice a year when relocated to Mumbai. Or a plant species known to grow prostrate on the ground on an open cliff top may be found growing erect on a forest floor. Or an animal species may hibernate over winter in the interior part of a continent but not in its coastal areas. Human organisms too are observed to have traditionally formed socially and culturally distinct societies in different environments. For instance, the coastal cultures of India share many common aspects, as do the cultures of the Deccan Plateau or those in the Gangetic Plains. A uniquely interesting example in this context would be the traditional polyandry observed in some remote Himalayan societies. In this social system, all the brothers of a generation jointly take one wife and family land is jointly inherited by all her children. This unique system points to an influence of a difficult environment in which fishing of already small land holdings would render agriculture uneconomical. It is thus quite fascinating to observe how an organism is influenced and shaped by its environment. The second process resulting from organism-environment interactions is quite obviously that the organism also influences its environment. Probably this process is nowhere as strongly obvious as it is in the interactions of human organisms with their environments, in which we find that entire landscapes and seascapes are altered by humans in attempts to make their environments physically more comfortable. Widely discussed and debated global issues, from introduction of genetically modified organisms into the environment to human-induced climate change, are just more examples of the levels and extents to which human organisms can influence their environments. But organisms may also influence their environment at a contrastingly microscopic level. For instance, consider a small herb growing on or near a rock. The roots of the herb find their way into rock cracks, widening them ever so slightly. Then minuscule amounts of plant debris accumulates in the cracks and starts to rot. Corrosive acids generated by the rotting biomass leach deep into the rock layers. Eventually, the weakened rock splits or crumbles. Though each such rock splitting event is occurring at an almost imperceptible level, the combined result of this process is spectacularly gigantic when you think of the global scale at which these events occur. The combined effect of plants all around the world contributing slowly and steadily to crumble massive rocks is tons of fine soil each year. Thus, it is equally fascinating to observe how organisms influence and shape their environments. The third process resulting from organism-environment interactions is probably the most fascinating one though. It is the process by which an organism changes its environment in such a way that it renders that environment unsuitable for its own survival. Let us explore how this can happen. Consider a patch of soil which contains too little nitrogen for most plants to grow well and therefore is nearly bare. A legume, say a wild moong plant, which has the advantage of harboring nitrogen fixing bacteria in its roots, can however grow in that nitrogen poor soil. A stage comes when the soil at that spot becomes capable of supporting even plant species which do not have any nitrogen fixing arrangements. In other words, the moong, together with its root bacteria, would have changed its environment from a nitrogen poor to a nitrogen rich one. What happens next? Once other plant species take root in that soil patch, they may thrive in it even better than the moong, which no longer enjoys any particular advantage over the others. Not only does the moong lose its earlier monopoly over the nutrients in the soil patch, it's likely to even get pushed out of the patch altogether by newcomer plant species that are better suited for the new conditions. Thus, that wild moong plant, along with its root bacteria, changed the environment in such a way that they ended up making it unsuitable for themselves. All these interesting interactions between organisms and their environments are studied systematically as a science called ecology. And a person who studies ecology is called an ecologist. Technically speaking, ecology is defined as the scientific study of the interrelationships among organisms, between organisms and all aspects, living and non-living, of their environment. So, what an ecologist tries to do is figure out the position of any given organism with respect to its entire environment. If such relationships are studied from the point of view of a single species, the ecological approach is called autecology. If all or many of the species occupying in an area are studied together as a community, the ecological approach is called synecology. The formalization of ecology as a science happened nearly 150 years ago. But even after so many decades of ecological studies and the uncovering of many ecological patterns, it is generally acknowledged that there is a tremendous lot that is still to be discovered and understood. Also, the ecological knowledge that we have accumulated so far is quite patchy, in the sense that we know a lot about some select pockets of the planet and very little about most others. And lastly, most ecological relationships tend to be quite subtle, and it usually requires considerable patience and sensitivity to perceive ecological truths and interpret them correctly. But if we remain aware of all these aspects and make sure to approach the subject by asking specific and precise questions, then, like all sciences, ecology can be a fascinating subject to study. So, in this module, we have looked at some of the key concepts of environment as to what is an environment, what are biotic and abiotic factors, what are the interactions between organisms and its environment, what are the outcomes of these interactions. We have also very briefly towards the end looked at what is this whole science of ecology. You can also take a look at our e-text. More reading can be found in the essential reading part. Thank you.